All right, we're out there and we're in progress. Welcome everybody officially to this session of conversations with CAGT, conversations with Colorado Association for Gifted and Talented. We've got a couple of guests tonight from the Colorado Department of Education who are going to be talking about some of our state guidelines for identification and part of the rules, rule and practice and identification. And I'm going to stay on camera for this and just be like that voice from the audience. And it's appropriate for me because in my day job, I work in the central office in School District 11 in Colorado Springs, and we have about 23,000 students. And each year, as we identify students, those identifications come through, that data comes through my computer, and I help the gifted resource teachers out in the field gather together the data and put together a body of evidence for um, identification for gifted. A lot of times that happens in second grade for us. We just had our universal screener. And so I know the rules very, very well. It's a part of my daily life. But I got to add this part too, that I have the opportunity to travel around the United States some and to see what is going on out there and to hear comments about identifications and see them in practice in one way or another. And oftentimes I hear from others, Colorado's really got it going on. And I absolutely agree with that. And every chance I get to brag a little bit about the state of Colorado and how we really have it together. We are a model for the United States on gifted education. We really are. And a lot of it, I think, comes back to and is expressed by this guidance we have for identification. It's insightful, it's inclusive, it upholds high standards that it allows people to make professional decisions. It is really high quality. And I've been in education, gifted education specifically, for more than 20 years. And I see where we have come from. And I'm really proud of what Colorado does and where Colorado has come from. And so, with that, I would like to introduce to you a couple of our Colorado Department of Education guides for this little tour tonight from the Gifted and Talented Department. We have Heather Baskin, and she is CDE's Assistant Director in the Office of Gifted Education. Additionally, she's a certified concept-based trainer, a member of the Colorado Association for the Educators of Gifted, Talented, and Creative, and an adjunct professor for CMU, teaching twice exceptional courses. She's over 17 years advocating for gifted youth and education. And we also have Michael Scott, and he is the professional learning and program monitoring consultant for CDE's Office of Gifted Education. He's had the privilege of visiting districts all over Colorado as part of the state's diagnostic monitoring process, which has allowed him to see a wide variety of district level practices designed to meet the needs of gifted and talented learners. And welcome, Heather and Michael.
Mark,
Thank you.
I will share my screen. And Mark, I'm glad that you talked about um, this being Colorado's identification and also how it reverberates around our nation. This is going to be very Colorado centric because we're going to be talking Colorado rule. However, if you're not in Colorado, I still think there's a lot of things that can be taken and learned and used. So this is not just for Colorado. I think it also just helps in the conversation of gifted education and supporting our gifted students as well. So um, I'm going to kind of take the lead here in the beginning, but Michael's going to jump in at different spots and then also at the end to talk about practices that he's seen across the state of Colorado as visits our different districts. So as we get into this, we are going to go through that gifted identification guidance and talk about rule, but then also talk about those practices and what we're seeing within our districts. And sometimes you'll hear me say AU, administrative units. That's another way that we classify our districts, and sometimes our districts are grouped together. So those terms are kind of synonymous, district and administrative unit. Before we begin, we just wanted to make sure, Michael and I wanted to make sure that we have this grounding of knowing that even though we're talking about identification, supporting gifted students is our highest priority. Supporting the growth of those students is our highest priority. So we can talk if a student is or isn't identified, but really the growth of the students is where our hearts are at and where we build our foundation. We also have to keep in mind that our kids defy convention, and identification is no different. That we can set all the different pieces in place, but they're all individuals, and that bullet there, if you've met one gifted kid, you've met one gifted kid, that they're all unique individuals. So let's get started on that with having that foundation in place. So really, why do we identify? Starting there of what is the reason that we look at identification. Again, our foundation is making sure we're supporting kids and supporting their growth, but that identification really supports that attention to programming and being able to look at that academic and that affective growth, or social emotional for the affective needs, making sure that we're doing that and that those things aren't falling through the cracks. Michael, I'm going to have you do the what happens when we don't identify, just because you speak so well to it. I'm going to turn it over to you for this next slide of when we don't identify, because we need to look at the other side of that too.
Thank you, Heather. And for all the educators who are watching, we know the importance of meeting the needs of the students in our classroom. And when we don't identify our gifted learners, we're talking about potentially not meeting the academic and affective needs of 1%, possibly more of our population. And research shows us that gifted students, especially when they don't receive that need for challenge and when they don't receive the services that they deserve, they actually become an at-risk population. And especially once you start to move to the high school level, which is where my background is, you start to see issues of you see issues of truancy, the chance of a high school gifted student dropping out if their needs aren't met is actually higher than that of the regular education student. And so, like I said, on one hand, we know as educators that it's important that we meet the needs of all of our students. But when it comes to gifted students, there can be that greater need. And so when we don't identify, we're missing a large of our student population.
Awesome. So, just a quick overview. And again, this is many of our educators will know this piece, but just a quick overview of the areas of identification within Colorado. And again, this is Colorado centric, but it still could help support um, gifted support and identification in other areas. So, the areas in Colorado that we identify, first, general or specific intellectual ability, and that's around the thinking, reasoning, problem solving, looking at students that have that general overall all piece or specific piece of intellectual and ability or abilities, not inabilities. um, we actually see, and Michael might be able to speak to this a little bit more too. We see this come into play kind of two different ways within AUs or districts. Some look at it as the exceptionality, our students that are twice exceptional, our language learners, English language learners. But then we also have some that look at those students that are overall, they are high in math, they're high in writing, they're high in reading, they're high in science. They have kind of an overall, not just one specific academic area. Anything you wanted to add, Michael, that are specific to what you've seen within districts or AUs there?
With a GIA identification.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, Yeah, I mean, and this will probably come into when we talk about the body of evidence later. But it's when, ideally, when you're collecting that body of evidence, it's going to align. And when we do identification training for the guidance, we usually like to say treating every piece of evidence like a finger pointing at something. So ideally, it should point towards a specific area of either academic or talent aptitude. But GIA is when you have those pieces of evidence. And for lack of a better term, that something's cooking, with that student, but it's not necessarily pointing in that specific area. So that's what we see is that they have a robust body of evidence, but it's not pointing in just one specific direction.
Yeah.
And I would add to that, like an example, how we see it often is with a student with two or three really strong cognitive scores,
Mhm.
Mhm.
not yet reflecting that in achievement. And I say not yet because a lot of times those students that are identified of general intellectual ability, like in second grade, and that academic piece comes along later. They mature into an academic piece. So that's how we often see it.
Great, thank you guys. Um, Another area, so areas of identification, part two is our specific academic. And then the areas underneath this are the reading, writing, math, science, social studies, world language. So that kind of gets into what we were just talking about of sometimes we have students that are really, really high in one of these areas, math, science, something like that, and we do a specific identification for that area, or we have the students that are high in a lot of different areas that sometimes we look at a general intellect of lots of different areas of that identification. Back to Michael's point too of we look at our evidence and which way it's pointing as we look at what area we're going to identify. And then the last one of the areas of identification are specific talents. So that's as we're looking at our visual arts, performing arts, music, dance. We also have psychomotor, creative, and then leadership too are within those talent aptitude areas as well. So all of the things that we're going to talk about as we go through common terminology and questions, it applies to any of these areas. It doesn't matter if we're talking about music or we're talking about math or we're talking about general intellect. The the body of evidence, the data, everything applies to those. I just wanted to make sure that you knew the different areas of identification, but everything we talk about is going to apply to all of those. Okay, so common questions we get, and we'll go through these quick because we go into a more specific as we get further down. But we get questions about what is rural and what is local control. So the state of Colorado is a local control state. There is rule, and it gives kind of your guardrails, but there is some local control within that. So a specific example of that is you have to have a 95th percentile on a nationally normed test, but it doesn't say what exact test you have to have. We don't have you have to have 95th percentile on a CMAS or you can't be identified. It doesn't ever say that. That's decided at the local level of what testing is going to be used. Locally normed data can be used as supporting evidence. And we'll get into this supporting and anchor evidence and that terminology means. But really that locally normed data can be used. And I'm going to say that's kind of a new thing that our districts are dealing with is how to use locally normed data. It's not it's not new like it just came out last year. I think we're just learning how to use it and how to support our identifications with it. Nationally normed observation scales can be a qualifying criteria for identification. So that's one that comes up as a question. Those observation scales are behavior and that kind of thing. And sometimes people are hesitant to use those, but those can be the anchor, that can be the 95th percentile that we're building the rest of that body of evidence around. Um, Need at least three pieces of data, not three nationally normed 95th percentile or higher scores. So this is one we've seen come up again and again. And Mark even might be able to talk to this because I know this has been around for a long time. We used to have guidance that it was you had to have three 95th percentiles. You had to have three scores before you could even start to look at identification. And we're still stuck in that thinking some. You do have to have three pieces of data, but they do not have to be 95th percentile or for all three of those. And we'll talk about that as we look at the body of evidence. I heard you or saw you very emphatically nodding. Mark, is there anything you want to add or just just agreement on that point?
I would say it's part of our the Colorado's progressive and inclusive and just really solid research-based background on what is giftedness too. But once upon a time, we called it the golden triangle. You had to have like a cognitive of a 95, an academic of a 95 that we thought matched the cognitive, and then like a teacher rating of a 95. Used to be that you couldn't be identified unless you had those things.
Right.
But I also noticed that typically students still have these pieces, when they're identified, the typical identification still has those.
Yeah. Yeah. And sometimes we see those that don't and they do still kind of surprise us because those of us that have been around for a long time we're used to that. I give an example a lot of times when I'm talking to educators of sometimes we'll get back a parent behavior scale that has like a 95th percentile in, let's say, social studies. And the school's like, we don't know where this is coming. Like, we're not seeing it. We don't know where this is coming from. And sometimes, and I know I probably would have been hesitant in the past to use that as a qualifying piece of evidence, but more conversation with the family and saying this student is super interested about the war in Ukraine and is following all the political parts of it and all of the different aspects of what's happening with the economics and everything. And they're in second grade. And we start to realize there's not a whole lot of opportunity in second grade for a second grader to show their interest in the Ukraine and the government and all of those different pieces that the parent might be seeing something that we're not necessarily seeing in school. So that's part of that inclusivity that Mark was talking about of making sure that we're using all of those that input and pieces of data to find our students that have those strengths that we may not know of or may not even see within school. Same, one score does not identify a student, but it doesn't exclude them either. So you wouldn't get that behavior scale and go, oh, yep, we're going to identify this student. We still have to look at a body of evidence with that student as well. But you also wouldn't get a score like, oh, that kid's not gifted. They didn't, I have heard before, they didn't pass the gifted test. There is not a gifted test. So a score can't qualify or exclude a student. We have to have both qualitative and quantitative data as part of the body of evidence. And again, we'll go into that further and what those terms mean too. You should know that that aligned body of evidence is what Michael was talking about. The fingers are pointing the data, where is it pointing? So they're aligned to an area, and that's what we would identify. Achievement identification without a cognitive score should be made with caution. We need to look at those over time so that we're not identifying a student that is a high achiever, great at school, but we may not need extra support for that student. So it's also asking what support that student needs. And then varied assessments to ensure that identification for underrepresented populations. We get really good in our education systems about this is the test we use, but sometimes we have to look at a broader range because our kids are, once you've met a gifted kid, you've met a gifted kid, and they are different and they sometimes require different assessments as well. I'm going to pause for just a second because I've been talking for a long time. Michael, is there anything that I've missed in those? I know you do identification trainings a lot.
Yeah, just a quick one. Like earlier when we had the slide about the nationally normed observation scales that we got, I wouldn't say pushback, but there was a little bit of alarm in the training because, the SIGs, the parent SIGs, is a nationally normed observation scale. And so they said, well, wait a minute, that can be a qualifying evidence point. We can identify with that. And of course, the response I had was, well, you have to build a body of evidence around it. We're not just using one score. So for those of you who are watching, if you see that, if that was your first thought of looking at that and seeing that a nationally normed observation scale can be a qualifying point of data, yes, that aligns with statute, but you still have to build the body of evidence around it. So, if you do have, and parents are a wealth of knowledge about their students, but if you do have that parent SIGs that comes back and it's all, you know, 99s, well, yes, that can be a qualifying point of evidence, but the body of evidence does have to align around it.
So maybe I'll throw in a question then,
Absolutely.
too, might be asked. And so an achievement identification, probably not going to happen for an elementary kid then.
Yeah, and I would say my opinion, this is my opinion, this is not rule, is if it does happen elementary, it's going to be definitely later elementary because it takes a while to get that body of evidence. It takes a while to see that that student is needing advanced support to be able to grow at that advanced level. So that's what I have seen in my practice. Michael, would you add anything or say anything different to that?
No, but not. Same thing.
Look at that. My opinion, Michael's opinion. Okay, so also knowing to identification team, and I am going to have Michael jump in on this one because he had a good example on this, but the identification team must use professional judgment when making determination decisions. The family must be included in the identification process, and that identifying students for a talent pool or even having a talent pool, that is local control. It is not in rule of cut scores or anything for talent pool or having to have a talent pool that is determined at the local level. So we need to make sure that you understand what your district or your AU has in place for that. So Michael, I'll turn it to you real quick about the identification team.
Yeah, I think when I do guidance training, that's one of the things that I think I keep coming back to is using professional judgment, because no two districts in Colorado are the same, and your local people, your ID team, they know the students, they know the school, they know the area, and so you're hearing it from us. Using professional judgment when it comes to identifying these students is critical. Yes, there is rule, and you want to follow rule and you want to follow guidance, but at the same time, using that professional judgment is key to catch, especially catching those students whose giftedness may not show up on a cognitive score. Or whose giftedness may not show up in achievement data. And we'll talk about that later when we get to practices that we've seen in the field. But using that professional judgment and knowing, what assessments to administer, how to build that body of evidence, and as we go through here, hopefully, those who are watching, you'll see that there is a lot of flexibility that's built into this.
Could could
I didn't even
you
think about it until you were just talking, Michael, but I think it's important to note too, in rule, it does say that identification team has to have at least one person that has been trained in gifted education on that team. So it's that professional judgment, but that professional judgment with training as well and understanding underserved populations of gifted in those different pieces too.
Yeah.
could you talk a little bit about the difference between a cognitive score and academic or achievement score?
Yeah, and I don't think we actually have slides on that. So, Michael, I think I took out like the specific ones that talked about that really specific. Talk about that really quick.
So, I think the best way we've talked about in the past is like it's really ability versus achievement. A cognitive score on a thing like like a COGAT or Naglieri general abilities or the Naglieri nonverbal. It's looking at a student's cognitive processing. It's how well they process, how quickly they process information. Whereas an academic achievement score is how well they achieve within a given subject.
Awesome, thank you. Okay, so one thing we wanted to cover really quick too before we get into, and we've kind of alluded to parts of this of rule and local control, is just a quick overview of how the Colorado Department of Education, how Michael and my job works within the whole system. So this is just really, really quick, but policy development structures, starting at that top line, our state legislature and our governor, they pass statutes. The governor signs in laws. An example of that in gifted education is the ECA that has part two of it, which is special ed rule within Colorado. The second part of it is all about gifted education, and that was passed a statute was law within our state. The State Board of Education and also the local board. So this kind of branches off just a little bit on this. The State Board of Education, they provide detail on the statute policy. Local board also works on that too. So one example of this is one part of our state law that is optional in gifted education is early access. It is out there for districts and AUs that want to use it, but the local control is a school board can decide if they want to do early access. And that is the entrance of 4-year-olds into kindergarten and 5-year-olds into first grade. But they can decide if they want to adopt access. We also have expert panels and stakeholder groups that convene to give input into different parts of policy or what policies we should be looking at, that kind of thing. And we have a gifted education state advisory committee. CAGT is one of those. So our institute that helps host these conversations. Local advisory boards also help set with local school boards as well. And then what our job is as Colorado Department of Education is to take all of that and provide documentation, the logistics, the parameters, guidance for those requirements, and then recommendations too. And so that's where we put together, here's the rule, here's some guidance that goes along with it of ways that you can do that. Here's some supports. So we do trainings and that kind of thing. And then also, as you heard earlier, one of Michael's jobs is monitoring and going and saying, here's what is, here's what you're doing in your district. Here are some great things. Here are your next steps. Here are some things that you're not quite meeting law yet. How can we shore those up to make sure that we are as a support system and coming at that with input from our families and our students and our teachers and all those different people that have input into those school systems and how gifted education works within the school system. So as we give guidance as the Colorado Department of Education, please know we haven't made those rules. We don't write those. The rule comes and then we provide guidance and all of that for all of our districts across the state and support and monitoring for that. Michael, anything I missed on that part?
I don't think so. I would add that one of the biggest pieces of support that we offer, and part of it is through being, through our work through monitoring, is being able to be links in a chain, and that we've been in as many districts as we have in Colorado, and that if we see, practices that are very strong, we're able to, for lack of a better term, kind of put that in our back pocket and think, okay, how can we apply this in other districts? Because one of our many mottos is we're looking like where's that gap between compliance and commitment, so compliance, of course, that's written in rule, and so we're always there to offer recommendations when it comes to compliance, but when it comes to that commitment piece, a lot of times what we're doing is we're looking at the practices in other AUs, and we're able to connect people. I think that's one of my favorite things in the job, is to say, I know somebody. I know you guys need help in this area. Well, you help this person, this person, this person, and they'll and the people that we recommend are always willing to help out. And so we may have gifted directors on different corners of the state, who may, have only seen each other in passing at the CAGT conference or something like that. But then we're able to put them in touch and make some really good things happen.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that because that is such a powerful piece. And we get emails and calls all the time of like, hey, I'm trying to do this and I don't know. And Michael and Terry, who also does our monitoring within our office, are great at going, okay, I know another like size district, or I know another district that does something like this, or maybe talk to this person, or they are so good at connecting those dots. And I think that's also something else that's made our state really strong, is being able to connect those pieces across the state. And actually, we're starting to get some traction of connecting those pieces across our country too. We've got some collaborations coming up with some other states too that I'm really excited about. So All right. So I'm going to go through this piece pretty quick because this is kind of the rule part that, because this is recorded, you can go back and listen to it. I want to make sure that I'm looking at our time too, and I want to make sure that Michael gets enough time to give those ideas of the practices and the things that he sees within districts, because I think that's where the real richness is. This part you can always come back to and go through rule. But we're about those gifted education guidelines. So that's from CDE, but it's based within rule. And then where the district choice is. And Michael's going to give those examples of the district choice, what he's seen when he's within those districts, within those AUs. So,
I can
um,
clarify. May I
yeah,
clarify
go
real
for it.
quick, Heather?
Do you want me to go
When you
back?
see, well, and I'm bringing this up because it has been said more than once in our guidance training. The C for district choice means that you have choice how it can be implemented. It doesn't mean that you don't have to do it, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
We've had a training or two where someone saw that C, and I don't know if they realized I heard what they said, but oh, that means we don't have to do that. It's like, oh, no, it just means that you have choice in how it's implemented.
Told Michael it might have been confusing to put early access in to start with because that one is a choice, but it's one of the few mandates of gifted education in Colorado that is choice. The rest of these are actually mandated. It's not choosing to do or not do, it's choosing how to do. Thank you for
Just
doing
to,
that, Michael.
well, just to be clear and you know, a little funny, because
Yeah.
yeah, I can see where it would be misinterpreted.
Yes. Okay, so going into referral process, and referrals can come from lots of different areas. So this is just to illustrate that we can have test data, we can have performance observations, checklists, anecdotal records, questionnaires. All these things can kick off a referral. It can link something up, or somebody sees or hears, or a test score pops up, or it's like, oh, we might need to start looking at this student for possible identification. So all of these things can come into play. Again, there is district choice and local choice in that of how they do their universal screenings, what they do for those, how they look and what test data they got. So that's local control, but referral is something that's mandated that once we have something that pops up referral, and even if it's a teacher saying, hey, I think we should look at this kid, that we do look. That doesn't mean there's necessarily going to be a whole other battery of tests, but those pieces that pop up lead to a referral, saying that we're going to look and see, do we need to look further for this student of being able to identify. Common terms we get into when we're looking at identification is so that qualifying data, we talked about that before, and there being an anchor point, the main data point. And this is really that qualifying piece that is 95th percentile. It could be the nationally normed ability tests, so like COGAT and NAT, the ones that Mark and Michael were talking about before. It could be a criterion reference test. NWA, CMAS, that kind of thing, a nationally normed referenced observation scale, or advanced performance evaluation, which often comes into play with our performing arts areas as well too. But it can be any of those, can be our anchor score that starts things. This is a graphic that we actually had a team across Colorado that helped build this, that looked at all of those pieces together and talked about, okay, this is our qualifying data point, that anchor point that starts us off with looking at, and that's often our referral, often, not always, but often our referral that starts us off in looking at that body of evidence. The next thing then, common terminology, is supporting data, that helps along with that qualifying anchor point to point us towards what strengths does the student have? What does the student need? And how do we look at that? Is it pointing us towards math? Is it pointing us towards dance? Is it pointing us towards general intellect? And those things can cover a lot of different, the anecdotal records, the interview, family input, that locally normed data that we were talking about before. All of those pieces can be part of that supporting data. And if you saw before that qualifying data here, and all these things around the outside can be that supporting data, those supporting data points that are qualitative. You can have quantitative too, that is also supporting data, but all those pieces that are looking at that full body of evidence, robust body of evidence that we're putting together. Um, Portability is another one that comes up. And, I honestly don't know this. This would be a good question across our nation. I'm not sure how many states have portability, but we have a student's identification once they're identified in Colorado. If that district has followed our state rule and used state rule, it is portable to other districts within Colorado. Um, it is the programming isn't necessarily transferable just because our districts have different programming also based on their size and offerings and where they are in the state, but that identification is portable. It becomes part of that student's permanent record that can go anywhere within Colorado. Now, again, these are Colorado state laws. So if they go out of state, it still is good to take that identification with because you still have a body of evidence, but the identification rules are different across the state.
What about students who come in from another state?
Yeah, yeah. So same thing we would look at, did that body of evidence that they have, does it meet our state criteria? And sometimes the answer is yes, and we can automatically identify. Sometimes it's no, but we continue to gather data. Sometimes it's, we don't have the data, we'll continue to watch, but it's if it state criteria, whether it's in state or out of state, we still can have that as an identification. Um, oh, look, I completely forgot that it was on there.
There is an
Um,
exception. There is an exception. It's the
yes.
next slide.
Yep. Yeah. So it includes student that moved to Colorado from another state. However, there's also the Military Interstate Children's Compact. That agreement is the exception that does follow the student. That compact is that the identification does follow the student. Also identification team, and we did talk about this before, but really that team comes together to just ask, does the student's body of evidence meet criteria? And that evidence also helps guide the development of the advanced learning plan. That's why it's also really important to look at those strengths and what the student needs, because then that helps us figure out what we need to do with the advanced learning plan.
And this is the piece that Heather talked about earlier. When it comes to rule states that someone has on that identification team has to be trained in the traits and needs of gifted learners.
Another view just to look at that quantitative and qualitative. Um, so again, the quantitative, the one on the left is more about the numbers. There's percentiles. That's about tests. That's our qualifying anchor points that we're looking at. Where the qualitative side is the qualities, the descriptors, the words, behaviors, characteristics. We have to have both on and body of evidence for identification. That supporting evidence is really important too. It's not just about, oh, here's the test scores, here's the numbers. Yes, we're identifying. We need to have that qualitative too because it helps us support the student.
And I want to give credit to Paula McGuire. She developed this slide for us when we did the ID training in the Northeast BOCES. So Paula, if you're watching this now or watching it later, thank you. This big help with this.
Oop, shout out to Paula. Also family input. So they like, and Michael said this before, there's valuable insights that our families give us about their students. That involvement is really important for the referral, but also for the body of evidence. How that comes in, again, local control on is it through a survey? Is it through an in-person meeting? How it comes in? I'm pausing because I thought you had something to say, Michael.
No,
Nope.
just family input. This was a case that came up in one of the trainings, and yes, family input is absolutely critical to this. But there will be those cases where you're not able to maybe get as much family input as you would like. And, our rule of thumb is, you don't want to, you have all the data that shows that this student is gifted, the student needs services. And, the family input may not be, like I said, at the level you want it to be. Um, we still want to do what's right by the student.
I want
So
to support the
please.
student and support the
Yes,
student's growth. Yep.
absolutely. Yeah.
Yep. Universal screening is another one common terminology that comes up. Many of our districts have universal screening in place. It's just essentially systematic assessment of all the students of a grade level. It could be, and oftentimes we have like a cognitive test that's in place, but it could also be those academic tests. We have state testing. Those are universal screenings as well, that we look at our students and look at the scores that could lead to a referral as well. Talent pool, again, we kind of talked about this before. There's not rule on cut scores for that, or even talent pool is actually optional. A district AU does not have to have talent pool, but it is a really good way to support students in before they're identified or in helping build those skills as we're building body of evidence for identification as well. I wanted to leave this one in just so that you could see, and hopefully, just the colors. Our words didn't travel over on this one, Michael, but I was like, ah, it'll be okay. In
The
looking
words
at,
the words were kind of small, and so for
yeah,
accessibility, it wouldn't have passed the smell test. So we I went in and took this out.
the blue being that quantitative, the numbers, the tests, that kind of thing, and the red being the qualitative, that you can look at a student. This could be one student over here that has one quantitative 95th percentile anchor score and two that are quantitative that support that body of evidence. That is a full body of evidence. Is this student to the right that has two quantitative scores, 95th percentile higher or exceed higher, and also has qualitative as well. They both have qualitative and quantitative. They both have at least three pieces of data. That is unique to each child of what data is collected and how much of that is put together. That then professional judgment, you go, yeah, we have a robust body of evidence showing that this student needs other support and would be identified gifted. All right. Local norms. I think we've gone over that one quite a bit. Again, I'm going to speed through these because, Michael, I want to get to you. I'm going to skip through the qualitative data pieces so that I can get to yours because, again, I want you to share. Let me go to this one really quick. Share my screen. There we go. Okay, so identification and practice, because I want to get us to get to this part. I'm going to turn it over to Michael. He's going to take the lead, and I'll jump in if I need to. Michael, you just tell me when to advance slides.
You're kind of setting me up. You're just like, we really got to get to Michael's, and so now everyone is
So
the
exciting.
anticipation's there. Let's temper those expectations a little bit, people. Um, let's take a look. All right, ID and practice, and so again, one of the hats that I wear is monitoring consultant, and so I go all over the state, and we see, we take a look at everything that applies to ECEA rule. The other part of monitoring is to look for program quality. And so these are just some of the quality practices that we've seen. Some of these common practices and trends. I'll talk about some of the universal things that we see, and then we'll briefly get into some of the practices that I thought were worthy of note. So I think this isn't everyone, but it is a common practice. Are those universal screeners at second grade and sixth grade? Um, and we see typically, and we don't endorse any specific test, but we commonly see the COGAT or the Naglieri nonverbal, or more recently the Naglieri general abilities test. We have a few districts that are piloting that for their universal screeners, and so those are done at second and sixth grade. And then we've seen a few common practices where the body of evidence, it has a cognitive piece, a performance assessment, can be that academic piece, behavior, and then observation from teacher and family, or teacher or family, most often the family. And then that's what they start with. They get all that together and then they continue. So we have seen some districts that are, when we say robust, it's a robust body of evidence that they collect, and I think rule of thumb for us when we do ID training is to say get as much as you can, unless the collection of that data creates a long enough time, like a really long timeline, to where the student isn't receiving services. But this is kind of one of those ones where, not to say gold standard, but we've kind of gotten used to seeing those in our ALP reviews that they make sure that they have those pieces.
And when you say behavior, you're talking about a broader general descriptive behavior, maybe gifted behaviors. Can a student's behavior in the classroom, like poor behavior, keep them from being identified?
No, no, it cannot. We've seen districts that, and I'm sure someone watching will know the name of the checklist that they use, but we've seen districts use their own created behavior checklists, and then we've seen ones do, I want to say, not a ranked checklist, but it's a checklist that has those behaviors of what we would call the non-teacher pleasing behaviors, the poor behaviors or the kind that would make a teacher or some people say like, well, like, that kid can't be gifted if they're subscribing to some of those myths and misconceptions. And so they'll have those checklists that have those again, for lack of a better term, non-teacher pleasing behaviors on there that indicate giftedness.
And I've actually seen too, Mark, districts that use those behaviors to help support that there's gifted characteristics there because some of the things, questioning teachers or, those different things that you actually are seeing some deep thinking there, but sometimes their behaviors, teacher pleasing behaviors that are hard to manage within a classroom as well.
Yeah. Okay,
Yeah,
thank you.
there was a recent monitoring visit similar to that. There was a student whose behavior in the classroom um, was not aligning to what this teacher, I guess, would have thought giftedness was. And the student was identified and began receiving services, and his behavior completely changed. And this teacher let the gifted coordinator know. She said that I thought I was just a bad teacher. I thought that that something wasn't working with my practice. And when the student was identified, it put this student on the radar of the people whose radar the student needed to be on. And so then again, just completely changed the student's experience for the better. I was able to receive targeted services. Right. And then we're seeing increased talent identification. We're seeing interest in leadership identification. Some we have some rubrics at the state level that we send people when they look at leadership ID. But honestly, um, some of the more interesting leadership identifications that I've seen in the monitoring process were the ones where someone was trained in the traits of giftedness and they knew that something was going on. And I don't want to say, they didn't need the rubric, but they had that eye for it and they knew the body of evidence to collect to begin to build that. So we are seeing an uptick in leadership identification. And then we're also seeing an increase in the use of access as the qualifying data point, that anchor point, in the same way that someone would use a 95th on a COGAT or a Naglieri General Abilities Test, using the access as that qualifying data point, and then building a body of evidence around that.
What's access?
Access is the language acquisition test for multilingual learners, and what makes it a qualifying point of evidence is if you see a 2-point jump in 1 year. And the other part was exiting the program. Heather, help me out. It's program exit within, is it a 2-year program exit?
Yeah, well, it's essentially it's essentially quicker than age peers. So you'd have to look at like age peers. I was going to jump in really quick. Actually, we had an amazing training yesterday in the West Central region where Nisha, who's down in our Durango area, Michelle, who's West Central region, and they came together and put together a great training on this and how we work as part of our culturally linguistically diverse staff, which was half of the staff there and half gifted teachers, how we work together and collaborating and using this data and other data too, because the access test is given to all of our students that are language learners. So that's a universal screener of our language learning students that we can use to see who is acquiring that language and that knowledge quicker.
Right. So these are some of the powerful practices that we've noticed around identification. Is gifted personnel, they're not stopping at a single test when seeking to identify. And we know that rule says that, but what I mean by that is a referral's been initiated because someone's seen some of those gifted traits, and the gifted director of record or the site coordinator or whoever it is, they step in, they meet the student, they get to know them, and again, this is where the training comes in and why it's important to know these traits. They see it and they're like, yeah, this kid's gifted, and they administer a COGAT or they administer an NGAT or an NNAT, and the student doesn't, for lack of a better term, another term we use is pop. They don't pop on the test. And rather than just saying, "Oh well, the kid must not be gifted," they're like, "No, something is going on." And so a lot of those districts will use other assessments. Sometimes it's the torrents. Um, Sometimes we've seen the whisk in a few cases, but giving a student the test that matches, that's just, I guess, for lack of a better term, more in line with who they are. Then they end up seeing the results that they were looking for because they knew that giftedness was there. So we do see that digging for data, and it's different than because someone who may not know the lingo may look at it and say like, well, that's kind of like, we're just giving them tests until they give you the score that you want. I think that's not how it works. If the giftedness isn't there, it's not going to show up on those assessments. But we do have those coordinators who they have that keen eye. Okay, well, they didn't quite pop on, maybe they got a 78, nothing higher than a 78 on the Kogat batteries, but then they give them a Torrance and they score like a 98, So that's what we like to see, is that there is that digging for data. They're not just saying like, well, they didn't hit the score we needed on the COG score, so they must not be gifted. It's more student aligned than assessment aligned. And then this is another one too. Uh, AU is continuing to collect data to program for students that once they're identified, the data collection process does not end. Once they get that identification, they're still collecting data because, of course, they want to see if the student's growing. You want to see growth, you want to see how they're doing, but other areas of giftedness may manifest. We've had, and this was just a monitoring visit I had a few weeks ago talking to students, and they would say, I was identified in third grade after the second grade universal screener, and then I was identified again in sixth grade for, maybe a different subject area or maybe even a talent area. And so that was a powerful practice that we certainly enjoyed seeing was when you have that just continuous collection of data and that another area of giftedness, that's there begins to show up. And so then they can program accordingly. And powerful practice FTE, you know, and I'm not trying to tell people how to spend their money, but
Wait, let me stop you really quick.
yeah,
FTE is full-time. It just is like a full-time teacher. So I just wanted
yes.
to stop with the acronym FTE, full-time
Yeah, and
teacher.
and and if you heard me, and forgive me if you heard me say GEM visit, gifted education monitoring. We live in alphabet soup as educators. It's no different at this level. You just get
And I
more
guess I
acronyms.
shouldn't just say full-time teacher. It's a full-time position. So sometimes
Right.
coordinator, teacher, whatever. But
Yeah. So for example, if you have if you're a gifted coordinator at zero point 0.5 FTE, that means 20 hours of your week goes towards that gifted coordinator position. Your other half, the other zero point 0.5 may be, as we've seen, like CLD coordinators or maybe even a teacher. So that's what FTE means. It means how much of your week is allocated to being able to serve the needs of gifted students in the capacity that you've been tasked with. Um, we saw this was on the previous cohort to this one. A district they committed FTE to having a district level identification team. They worked hand in hand with their data department and they were doing weekly data reviews. And they saw more identified students than the state average because they had their eyes on it. They were trained, they were looking, and it was that was a by far a powerful practice because they had committed people to making sure that every student's data was seen and reviewed and again, we looked at the ALPs, we looked at the bodies of evidence. I mean, this is completely within rule, and so they're there. And they committed a team to look for them. And then training teachers and administrators is what we said earlier to look for some of those less known gifted traits for referrals. Um, some of the high scores and knowing the answers and those are the things that we when you ask someone what is gifted, they may give that answer, but having teachers understand those less known and those non-teacher pleasing behaviors so that they can initiate a referral. And then also, too, training them to know that they can make a referral, that they can, who do they go to, that they can talk to their building lead, or if it's a smaller district, the district coordinator and say, I've got something going on with this kid. And this is one we've seen recently as well, is when they do the COGAT for a universal screener, and I would say really any universal screener, how do regular education teachers use that data? Because yes, it is great for beginning the process of collecting a body of evidence to identify gifted students. But I think cognitive score data um, is useful across the board. And so that was a piece of that buy-in, creating that buy-in to where people aren't just thinking, oh, well, the COGAT's coming up. That's the gifted test. Like, no, this is a cognitive abilities test. And again, it doesn't have to be the COGAT, but for them to look at it and say, this is information that I can use to improve my practice with my students. That was a powerful practice that we saw. And I'm handing it back to Heather.
I was just
Uh,
pointing to you. I
hopefully,
was like, you can do this part.
hopefully it met all expectations as much as you kept, you know, Michael's part's coming. Michael's part's coming.
Well, I love that. So that this part's just in there. Other questions, other things. There's a lot of information on our website, and honestly, this logo here is a little teaser that our website is coming up on a big shift. We're looking beginning of March-ish, maybe a little sooner, maybe a little later, but our
You're a small
website
but
is
mighty
gonna.
office.
Yes, yeah, is going to have this banner on it soon. I wanted to put on this is you'll still get to it the same way from this website, but our contact information is on there. There's lots of information on there about the topics we were talking about. The changes that you're going to see have sections clearly for families, clearly educators, clearly for directors that go through not just identification but other pieces too. But feel free to reach out to us with questions and that kind of thing because rule and all of that can be confusing, but also how does that look in practice? And we were hoping to bring some of those pieces today, but it also it always there's always still questions because we're dealing with individuals, individual kids, individual teachers, individual systems. And so there's always going to be questions that come up. It's never going to be just cut and dry.
And when we look at the information I get from the monitoring piece of those common trends, I mean, it's a bird's eye of a bird's eye view. We delivered a similar presentation um, just yesterday on what we've seen in the past few years with monitoring visits, and I wasn't volunteering this, but I said, we could spend a whole day because identification is just one piece of ECE rule. You have those 12 other pieces. You have community, family and community engagement. You have programming, personnel, and I mean each of those we could talk about all day. So
Mark, was there any questions you had lingering that we didn't go through or that you can think of?
I mean, that's a lot of information and talking fast, and it still
uh,
took us an hour, and it's just touching some of the ways that I think we can get lost in the weeds sometimes
Yes.
on the whole identification question, and but if we always come back to saying, okay, we're doing this to try to take care of kids,
Yeah.
and it's not that like it's not a blue ribbon badge you put on your back if you have a gifted identification. And some of the coolest things happens with kids who like are in that talent development category where they don't have quite those numbers. to be identified gifted. It doesn't matter if we're taking care. We gotta take care of the kids. I guess that's not really a question, but kind of where where I land so many times, and because it is easy to get lost in the weeds too.
Yeah, and really being about growth. That's why we started with that big foundation part to start with is it's about the growth of students. And if you have a student that's advanced, how are we going to make sure that that student is growing and learning? Because that's what our schools are for, is for our students to grow and learn. And not to, oh, they already know end of third grade. They're at the beginning of third grade. We don't need to do anything. No, we do. We need to make sure that they're learning and growing throughout the year as well. So.
Yeah. Well, I thank you both for taking your evening to lend that expertise and give us the overview. This is one of those good ones that you could, if you get back on YouTube, and I'm just throw that out there again. If you're watching this on YouTube, you already know. But these conversations with CAGT are archived through our website, coloradogifted.org. You can watch probably 60 or 70 presentations. There are a lot. And it's full of people who really care about gifted kids. It's full of people who are experts, and it's just tons and tons of information. So you can watch these, everybody. Also, catch us live here once a month now. We're doing once a month, and in the month of March, I think we're doing one. And you just watch your CAGT Facebook feed. Subscribe to us if you're not already. But I think we're doing it on primary gifted children. So come back and catch us again at that time. But I want to thank you both so much, and thank you for the work that you're doing, and thank you for being with us, and all of those wonderful sorts of things.
Thanks for having us.
Mark, thanks for having us.